Well, I studied painting, and in grad school there was a lot of kind of maybe rage that I felt towards the history of painting and the how it sort of did not allow for space for the type of paintings I wanted to make, and or at least in my head, that's how it sort of felt at the time. And um, but I think, despite the rage, I actually really love painting and look at painting and find a lot of inspiration in painting. And I also, throughout my interest in painting, throughout my whole life, I noticed that people have very strong feelings about what a painting should or should not be. So it's very interesting to me that this question of is this object a painting comes up repeatedly with my work, because it sort of, to me, calls attention to the fact that certain objects get the privilege of being a painting and other objects are questioned, like, are you really a painting? Like, are you crossing all of the conventions that a painting should have? And sometimes I actually, with my students, especially when I teach painting, I ask them to think through, like brainstorm what kind of conventions of painting apply to them, because it actually seems to be a very personal set. As someone may say, it has to have paint. If it has paint, then it's a painting. Someone may say it has to hang flat on the wall, then it's a painting. Someone may want like a whole bunch of other qualities.
Right.
So
there's no like overarching authority that like stamps things as paintings.
Exactly. But it's like, as you hear people's attitude about what it is that they believe a painting should have, it kind of gives you a sense of, what is important about a painting, like what could be like let go, and what really needs to be there in order for it to be still called a painting. So, in my head, these are paintings. But of course, because of, the aforementioned rage, I'm still like trying to navigate, like, how can it be a painting, but also talk about the exclusion that painting historically had for lots of different type of people. So when I break away from the painting or question certain conventions within a painting, like make a hole or expose a stretcher or have three-dimensional elements, in some ways those are things that I do in order to kind of interrogate those conventions and also show how elastic they are. That part of what attracts me to painting is actually that you could stretch it.
Right.
And I like to stretch things.
Well, that actually, that was actually one of my questions. So, your work obviously incorporates a lot of different gestures beyond, applying paint to a canvas. And so I'm curious, because a lot of them require pretty elaborate construction or stretching of materials over the bars. So I'm curious for you, in terms of your process, how kind of open to improvisation, and kind of just play are they, and to what extent you kind of map them out or sketch them out ahead of time?
Well, I'm very curious to know if this is like a rhetorical question, because no, you truly.
No agenda.
Okay. Because in my head, it feels like I'm not a planner. At least not in the studio. I mean, I may have certain like ideas about size or scale or materials I want to use, but as far as what happens in each painting, it's a journey that I like to keep as a surprise as long as possible, because as soon as I know what's going to happen, it kind of takes away from my desire to keep working on it. So that process of discovery and surprise is something that really keeps me motivated in with a particular piece. And I don't typically sketch out the paintings, but what I do is at a certain point when it's maybe like 80 to 95% done, but I don't know how to kind of like get it to that yes. I usually sketch it then. I make a bunch of sketches and little kind kind of color studies to figure out what that element needs to be. So and that process for me is sort of similar to like painting a portrait of a person, because at that point the painting is already really anthropomorphized in my head. Like it has a lot of qualities that I feel like, you know, I could relate to, or they're sort of speaking to me, or they're telling me about something, and there's a conversation. And when I start to feel that the painting has that kind of chattiness, that's when I try to make sketches and kind of see if that leads me to a conclusion. And, you know, sometimes it does and sometimes it does not. So, but that's really the only planning that happens. And you're sure that doesn't come through like on first glance?
No.
Okay.
Well, that's part of why I asked, is because I think in a lot of ways they have like a very playful quality, but then the way you use materials feels in a lot of ways is extremely deliberate, but also it feels like it must have been done with some pretty serious planning, just because they are so structural in a lot of ways. So that's sort of why I was asking.
Yeah, I mean, I think that kind of planning, like I want to stretch this color linen on this size stretcher bars, and like that will have, you know, this kind of minimal planning does happen. And oftentimes it'll be a pattern that kind of starts me off, like with the Trojan City Never Sleeps, it was the horses, you know, so it's like before there was anything of the painting, there was that print that I knew I wanted to connect to the gray linen and the pink neoprene, and I just had them kind of laying next to each other for a long time, kind of getting to know each other. And then once they start to kind of coalesce into an object, I try to just be as loose with it as I can, which, you know, sometimes is not that possible.
Sure. Well, that since you brought up the textiles, I'm curious. You know, I think your background comes across in a few of the works in a way that if you didn't know what you were looking at could get missed pretty easily. Like if you don't know necessarily the origins of the certain textiles you're using, one could easily miss that. So I would love for you to sort of talk a little bit about how you source the textiles you incorporate into the work, and what they kind of have, what meaning they have for you that doesn't necessarily come across if you don't know what you're looking at.
Well, I definitely feel like textiles as a thing is something that I was attracted to from a very young age. And you know, even in Soviet Russia, where we didn't have like a lot of clothes, like a lot of different types of garments, but we had let's say embroidered curtains or linen tablecloths, which were not really that they weren't really considered for one reason or another as that valuable. They were pretty kind of mainstream. So like certain associations that linen has here didn't really exist, at least not to me as a child when I was growing up with them, but they were, you know, elaborately hand embroidered. And you know, half of my family comes from Ukraine, which has its own sort of history of embroidery and pattern making, and that talks to, you know, the people who know it immediately recognize it. And then my mom's side of the family comes from Uzbekistan, and that also has like a very specific history of textiles and pattern, and how that sort of articulates commonalities within that culture. So growing up in Moscow and seeing those two different textiles happening kind of simultaneously, made me think, maybe not in super concrete terms, but later on I think I started to think more concretely about this notion that patterns, these decorative patterns, actually are coded with meaning, that they mean something to like people who are part of that culture. In the most basic sense, they're kind of a way to call out to the people who are like in the culture, and let you know that you're, you know, get it, or you're part of this. It's sort of like this flag. But I think that beyond that, there's also a lot of meaning in them. And I think that meaning is very hard to pin down. And that's why they're so exciting for me, because they're making this pattern which almost is like another language, like a subtext. But when I try to kind of spell out what it all means, I start, kind of saying very cliche things about a particular culture. So it's like you can't navigate it without like falling into these pitfalls of like, well, I think you might be exaggerating or simplifying things, and not all Ukrainians are like that, or so I'm interested that they're both so beloved by people and yet refuse to be kind of articulated in what it is they're actually saying. So like over there I have a Ukrainian embroidery, and most of the fabrics I use them with the intention to create a dialogue between different materials. So like linen next to neoprene, next to spandex, next to silk, like what kind of associations come up? Like what does linen mean versus spandex? Like what kind of class, gender associations it evokes? So I I'm interested in the kind of the raw material of the fabric and what that tells the viewer before I even do anything, like that it's so rich on its own.